Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a former Boeing 737 pilot and a member of the PMDG 737 tech team. In today's tutorial, let's discuss the go-around procedure in the PMDG 737 in-flight simulator 2024. So there are a couple of variations to this procedure depending on a couple of choices that you made during the approach. So before we start with the go-around procedure itself, let's quickly discuss those. If the approach has been flown on a single autopilot only, and that is going to be the case for most approaches since you would only use both autopilots when an autoland is intended, since with both autopilots engaged the airplane would trim itself tail heavy at 400 feet radio. So if the approach is flown with a single autopilot only, pressing the toga switch is going to completely disconnect the autopilots. Only if both autopilots were used, the autopilot is going to stay engaged for the entire go-around maneuver. So the procedure will have to be flown manually. Also, depending on whether your airplane is equipped with the toga to LNAV feature, which can be identified by seeing LNAV arm in white on the FMA during the approach, if your airplane is equipped with that feature, then LNAV is going to come on automatically in the go-around. If it is not equipped with that feature, you have to select LNAV manually at 400 feet in the climb. Now, let's talk about the go-around procedure itself. Either pilot can at any time call a go-around, but the pilot flying will initiate it. Only if the pilot flying fails to do so, the pilot monitoring would take control and then initiate the go-around. So the go-around is initiated by pushing the toga switch a single time. Verify that thrust increases and call go-around flaps 15, set go-around thrust. With a positive rate of climb, retract the landing gear and verify that go-around thrust has indeed been set. Now, if you are not using the auto throttle during the approach, which is commonplace for any manually flown approach, since you normally fly without auto throttle when flying manually, you will have to set go-around thrust manually. There are two settings that you need to be aware. There is the standard go-around thrust and there is the reduced go-around thrust. So let's start with the reduced go-around thrust, because that is the one that the system would give you if you press toga only a single time. Reduced go-around thrust is automatically calculated by the auto throttle so that it gives you sufficient thrust so that in the given conditions, so airplane weight and environmental conditions, you would get a rate of climb between 1 and 2,000 feet a minute. This makes the go-around rather relaxed, taking the speed out of things. If you press toga a second time, you are going to get full go-around thrust, and that is sometimes going to result in very high rates of climb. So normal go-around is just a single press with reduced go-around thrust. If full thrust is needed, press toga a second time and you get the full thrust. However, since auto throttle is going to be off on approaches, you have to set the thrust manually. Now, reduced go-around roughly 85%, full go-around roughly 95%, up to the green marking if required. Now let's go ahead and revise and then put it into practice. So, push toga, call go-around flaps 15, set go-around thrust. Retract the flaps to 15, ensure the thrust is set to 85%, minimum. Now, when the positive rate of climb has been achieved, retract the landing gear. At 400 feet, verify or engage LNAV and tune the radios for missed approach. When the airplane is above 400 feet with toga mode active, the flight director is going to command an acceleration. Once past the flaps 15 reference speed, retract the flaps into position 5. Once above the flap 5 reference speed, retract them to flaps 1, and when above the flap 1 reference speed, retract the flaps in up. Once leveled off at the go-around altitude, engage the autopilot and run the after takeoff checklist, and then we can decide on the further course of action. So determine what caused the go-around, can we fly a second approach over here, or should we divert to our alternate airport, how much fuel do we have left, and all that kind of stuff. So it sounds rather easy, let's go for it and see how that turns out in practice. So I'm going to disengage the autopilot and the auto throttle over here, since that would be the condition in which we would find ourselves in most approaches. So let's go out of active pause and let's get going. So we're on approach over here, everything looks nice and stable, but ATC calls us a go around. So let's go for it. Go around, flap 15, set go around thrust. Press toga, 85% N1, and flaps 15. Now we've got a positive rate of climb, gear up.
Too low, gear.
Disregard the warning,
Low, gear.
and follow the flight director to achieve go around performance. Verify that the thrust is at least at 85%, and passing 400 feet, LNAV and tune radios for missed approach. So since we are above 400 feet, we can start retracting our flaps, being above the flap 15 reference speed. So let's go to flaps 5, and while we're doing that, you can see that our speed bug increases because the airplane commands the further acceleration. We're now above the flap 5 bug, so let's retract the flaps into position number 1. And finally we're above the flaps 1 speed, so let's retract the flaps and up. Remember, you have to fly the entire procedure manually, and Toga is now going to set the flaps up speed plus 20 knots as our new speed target. So that is the way that the system is programmed over here. The flight director nicely leads us up to 3000 feet, and you can see with the reduced go-around thrust at 85% over here, that works really easily, making this a rather relaxed maneuver. If you went to full go-around thrust, things would probably look a little bit different here. As we're approaching the level of altitude, we are going to follow the flight director's commands, reduce thrust to approximately 60% N1, which normally leads to a nice flaps up speed plus 20 knots over here, like this. Alright, now let's engage the autopilot in Command A and the auto throttle, and with that we can do the after takeoff checklist. So landing gear off, auto throttle off, start switches off, taxi light should be off anyway now, and then we can do the after takeoff checklist, decide on what has caused the go around, and now make a decision, are we going to fly a second approach or not. If you don't tell ATC anything, they will assume that you are going to fly a second approach, so chances are that they're already going to take you onto a vector in for a second approach over here. So if you need to divert to an alternate that's anywhere in the direction of your missed approach, tell ATC early, so that you do not have to waste any fuel on the approach. Now let's take a moment to talk about reasons for the go-arounds and whether to fly a second approach or not. The most common reason for a go-around is that the runway is simply still occupied, either because the preceding aircraft has not vacated the runway yet, or because of a possible runway incursion. In those cases, a second approach is usually warranted. However, if you're flying to an airport that has only a single runway, always keep in mind that you may not be able to conduct a second landing there, provided that the runway closes for whatever reason. So do have that in mind. Overall, it really comes down to the situation in question and to pilot judgment. Now, if the go-around has been done due to bad weather, that is a different thing. A second approach should only be commenced if you've got enough fuel that you can still make it to the alternate after the go-around, and an entire go-around takes approximately 800 kilos of fuel in the 737. So look at your fuel, we got 3.8 tons right now, then going down into the performance page we need 2.6 to divert to the alternate, so if we burn another 800 for a second approach, we would end up at 3000 kilos, so we still have plenty of fuel to divert to our alternate. So if this go-around would have been caused by weather, then a second approach could be attempted. However, be aware that a maximum of 2 approaches may be conducted unless the weather has significantly improved in the meantime, so that there are reasonable chances that a second approach or a third approach would be successful. So remember that if the weather is borderline, it may be more sensible to go into a holding and wait for a weather improvement, because if a second approach fails, you are not allowed to conduct a third approach unless the weather has significantly improved. Other go-around reasons, especially if the visibility is far below minimum, it's usually better to divert to the alternate airport, But again, it does come down to pilot judgment. Now, if it is decided that the second approach is going to be commenced, the setup for that second approach is initiated through the departure and approach page by simply reselecting the approach. So you got Palma, select that as arrival airport, reselect the approach, so ILS Zulu Romeo 24 in case of our tutorial, press execute, reinsert the fixed page as necessary. So Romeo 24 left, /10 miles and /4 miles. And with that, reselect the auto brake, reselect the landing flaps down here. Those do clear on the go around. So reselect the landing flaps, and with that, conduct a short rebriefing just to emphasize the most important points of the approach again. Also remember to tune your approach frequencies again if they have been deselected during the go around. Consider a small PA to your passengers to reassure them of what's going on, and, you know, up to you to decide whether or not you're going to tell them the true reason for the go-around. Also quickly talk to the flight attendants, tell them what happened, and tell them on your decision whether you're going to conduct a second approach or whether you are going to divert to your alternate airport. From here on, repeat the descent checklist, repeat the frisk, the approach checklist, and from there it turns into a very normal approach again. So that's really everything there is to it. Thank you very much for watching. As always, like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.